So first of all, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians and First Peoples of Australia and their continued connection to their country and culture. And we pay our respects to elders past and present, to all our First Nations people. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming along. This week we have O-Spec, and we have a little bit of housekeeping to get through, and I'll run through the agenda. If we could all mute our speakers, that would be great. And then professional learning, you can have 2 GCA CPD points for each forum that you attend. Surveyors Registration Board are 2 other FPET points for each forum that you attend, except for, and all this goes for, except for the showcase, which is 3 hours, so you get 3 points. And the LSLB in WA, which is the registration board in WA, give you 2 education points. We also ask that you do keep your cameras on, because it's a little bit nicer for our speakers to have a face to speak to sometimes, and it gives them a little bit more indication as to whether what they're saying is of interest and is hitting the mark. So it's really great if you could do that. If you are dialing in on the phone and you have a call to take, please hang up and take your call, then dial back into the forum. When you leave your phone on, we get the feedback and hold music, and it is a little bit distracting. This is a forum, and it's a consortium or group of people that get together to discuss and understand the specs, and in particular today O-Spec. So please, if you have a question that you would like to ask, just unmute yourself and ask your question, or put it into the chat and I'll interrupt the speaker and address that question for you as well. And as you have seen, we do live polling. So George will stop a few times throughout his presentation to ask you some questions about some of the things that he's showing on the screen. So please, if you can participate in those polls, it really helps George and the team at GISA to make sure that we are continuing to provide you information that is useful. So also letting you know that this session is being recorded, and we will release the recording at the end of the forums. So the as they get recorded, we clean them up and download them and put them on YouTube, and we'll send you out a big thank you email with all the links and things that we showed you, and other references that we might refer to during the presentations, and links to all of these recorded forums. So keep an eye out for that in the in October. And just to get you started and warmed up for the live polling, we do have a couple there that are live at the moment. In particular, we were really keen to understand your level of knowledge of O-Spec. So if you could please submit your vote on that one. And we were just doing, Phil had a bit of a thing around which magazines are the magazines that our audience are reading. So if you could please answer that one, and I'll pop another one up a bit later, which asks our audience where you're from in terms of, are you a council, are you a surveyor or / consultant, etc. So I'll pop that up. If you could answer that poll, that would be great as well. So I think just in the next slide, please, George, in this session, we have George coming up to talk about O-Spec. We then will have community experiences. I think actually, George, we have Gaby doing training. So he'll show some tips and tricks around the specs, and then we'll have 2 community presentations. So this year what we've done differently is we've invited our users and community and data capturers to present their experience using the specs, and in particular today O-Spec. So today we will have Brendan McNamara from RapidMap presenting, and also Jack Richardson from the city of Mandurah. So these presentations that we've done so far, we've done B and D spec so far, and the presentations have been fantastic. So we expect it to be the same or similar today. But anyway, I think that's all I need to tell you. I'm going to hand you over to George, and he's going to talk to you about O-Spec. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Kelly, and welcome everybody. As Kelly said, my name's George Havakis, and for the next 30 minutes, I'm going to take you through some content around O-Spec and talk about some of our experiences in dealing with the community. So the first thing I want to mention is that new releases, 4th of September 2023. And I'll, in my wrap-up, I'll show you how you can access those documents. But if you go onto the website now, you will be able to see that those documents are available and, excuse me, and also some sample data, which I'll talk further about that. For people who are new to A-SPEC, we have two sets of documents, and I'll and briefly what they are about is that the document on the right, which is O-SPEC DDS version 3.0.6, is the document that is referred to when dealing with new subdivisional activity, capital works activity, community projects, where assets are designed and built from scratch. The document on the left, which is O-SPEC existing, is a mirror document of O-SPEC DDS version, and I'll show you what I mean by that in just a moment. So essentially, that one is geared up for organisations that are undertaking backlog data capture, or maybe undertaking some kind of project in the field, typically with stormwater drainage, doing flood modelling and the like. Consultants are often asked just to pick up some additional data about stormwater drainage. So it would be the existing version that would be used. And similarly for parks, if consultants are asked to go out and pick up all the park furniture, then potentially that is the document that you would use. Now, when you go into the DDS version, I'm picking playgrounds as an example. As you can see, I've just highlighted just a snapshot of that particular table. Column name, data type. If you're not familiar with it, this is the structure of every asset table in every specification. So we're really specific, we're really granular around what we request is to be captured and delivered to the consultants, to the councils and other authorities. And this is the kind of, and the conversations that we have with the asset owners is, are we capturing, or are we stipulating the data to be captured is valuable from an asset management perspective? Because there are two elements to it. One is a GIS component, and the other one is the attribute component. So this table exists in the DDS version. Now, when I also took a snapshot of the existing version document, and it's exactly the same. The only difference is that there is a column at the end. And what we've done is we've had a look at every attribute in every asset table to see, and we've categorized it to provide guidance as to the importance of that particular feature. So this is a really good example because it shows all of the three categories: the core requirement, the optional requirement, and the YR, yes, required, and may need more research. Now, at the end of the day, excuse me, at the end of the day, you may end up providing defaults. However, it is a requirement to go and provide that detail there. So when you're, so irrespective of whether using the existing specification or the DDS specification, the fields are exactly the same. The technical requirements are exactly the same. We've looked at it from a pragmatic perspective. If you're out in the field, what can you practically capture? And then the YR is usually things that aren't necessarily available in the field, but available through some further research in looking at the as constructed plans. Now, as we go through today, don't hesitate to put questions in the chat. Kelly and Gabby are monitoring the chat, and they'll alert me to a question that comes up from somebody from who's attending. This has been really great the last couple of forums because people have had an opportunity to stipulate what question they have at the time that we're talking about a particular topic. So rather than waiting to the end, we don't have any panel sessions. However, this is an interactive session, and we encourage you to raise your questions as they become evident for yourself. So what else have we been doing? We've been presenting this at each of the forums to give you an idea of the kind of background that we've gone into whilst we're not updating the specs. Yes, we've been updating the specs. We've actually been updating the specs for the last 4 years, and there aren't, in the scheme of things, there are not a lot of changes when you start talking about the number of new asset classes. I think there's 4 or 5 across all of the specs. There's a lot of changes with the code lists. There's a lot of changes with some of the descriptions, and there's some changes with the attributes, and I'll give you an indication of that in just a moment. We've also reviewed other national and international initiatives such as VBIS, VDAS, which are specific to Victoria, and then Uniclass, which is an international ISO standard. I'll come back to that in just a moment. We've created some new sample data, which I mentioned a bit earlier, and one of the things that we've done is that when we've updated each of the specs and each of the layers, we've also had a look at what attributes have been added or removed. And we've provided that, and we've done that for every specification. If you're interested in this, happy to make it available. It's in a spreadsheet so that you can just search by spec, you can search by layer name. If you would like it, if you would like us to send you a copy of it, just put your name in the chat and say, please send me the changes spreadsheet, or your name and spreadsheet, whatever is simpler for you, so that we will be asking you to put your name in the chat box a few times. That way we can stipulate, we can identify what you're responding to. As I mentioned, we've been looking at other national and international initiatives that are going on. So in the context of all of the specifications, we know that Uniclass is an ISO standard, and it's being specified in a number of initiatives across the country. And one of the things that I've noted in Victoria is that it's actually been recommended by the Victorian Digital Asset Strategy that Uniclass is utilised. So it's had consultants and asset owners go off and have a look at, what can we expect. So we did a bit of a deep dive, and Philip Nelson from our organisation has done that. Oh, speaking of which, I've done it again. I forgot to introduce everybody from our organisation, so just bear with me for a minute. So yes, so Philip Nelson, just raise your hand there, Philip, and your digital hand, the other hand, and that way it'll come to the top of the screen for people. We also have some interns that we've started here, and Joey, can you please raise your digital hand as well? Yep, that'd be great. And also, Yue, if you're on, can you please raise your digital hand? So Joey and Yue are two of our interns, and we're very happy to have them on board and work with us, and we're giving them an opportunity to have a look at what it's like to participate in a work environment, because they haven't had that kind of work experience before. And also Kelly Ireland, who you've heard from, and she's been a stalwart of our forums and put in a lot of ideas as to how we present, and has actually mentioned to me when I put in too much detail, because I think she's not very kind to me. She tells me her eyes hurt when I put in too much detail. So I really have to focus and, make sure that I don't overload people with too much detail. So anyway, if I've missed anybody, Phil or Kelly, just let me know. So getting back to the specs. So
Gaby.
Oh, yeah. How can I forget Gaby? Gaby van Veek, who is one of our partners and the lead for our Digital Hive business that we have formed, and Gaby you'll hear from Gaby later in the tech tips and the tech talk session. Thanks, Kelly. So getting back to O-Spec. I've given you that Philip has gone through every specification and done a deep dive to get a sense of how the categorization occurs in Uniclass, how the categorization occurs in VBIS. And you can see here, for example, there's area work extent. It can be generally covered in Uniclass, but there's no example in VBIS to cover that. The same with open spaces, playing fields, and so on, which is fairly consistent with their approach of looking at the built environment more so than open space and recreation environment. So as you can see further down with fences and walls, there's quite a lot of categories, and their examples are based on giving each type of fence a code. So as you can see there in the description, fences, chain link, etc. So they've provided a type of code under their particular classification system. Whereas in Uniclass, there's the Uniclass code and the subcode of barriers. Whereas, as you know, within the A-SPEC environment, we'll have a table that specifies that it's a fence or a wall, and we have the attributes that describe all the different characteristics of that to enable the asset owners to pull out the data that they need to be able to slot this data into their own hierarchies in their asset management environments, and also into the GIS environments. An example of the level of granularity, as I mentioned, is so this image above shows an area within a recreation reserve, which was scheduled to undergo significant development. Uniclass doesn't allow the scope of works to be easily defined, whereas we know we want to cover that in A-SPEC, and so there is a level of granularity that A-SPEC goes to because it feeds data straight into corporate systems. And the other thing that one of our observations is that, particularly with Uniclass, not that there's any issue with it, to cover all the potential, if you were going to capture trees, for example, to cover all the potential species, it'd be quite an onerous task, and there probably aren't enough, there isn't enough flexibility in the coding system at the moment to cover all of those. So it's, you know, horses for courses, as they say.
George, if I could just add that there's no facility in either of those systems for you to record details such as the manufacturer, model number, serial number, or other specific information relating to an asset. So even down to street furniture and so on, there's no facility to record even the manufacturer of that product. So it makes it difficult to perhaps replace or service that without that sort of detail.
Thanks, Phil. And look, and it raises, it just reminded me of something. We talk a lot about Revit. We talk a lot about different classification systems. So Uniclass is a classification system. IFC, or Industry Foundation Classes, is a classification system. OmniClass is a classification system. There are a number of classification systems to enable the architectural and engineering sectors to be able to categorize their elements through the planning, building phases of projects. To take that into account, our focus is what data can we pull out of that complies with an A-SPEC environment. So if you're an A-SPEC authority and people are giving you Revit files, that's okay. That's one thing. You know, it'll be data rich. What we focus on is what are the schedules that can be created to automatically populate the A-SPEC data so that that's what you extract out of the Revit environment. And we're now seeing how Revit is being linked to asset management environments, asset management systems, just as asset management systems are linked to a GIS, so that there is that level of integration. So you don't have to pull in everything, you just pull in what you want. Our focus is to pull in the A-SPEC related data that then feeds into the corporate system from there. If you have any further questions about that, you know, please pop it into the chat, and I'll probably wait till the text session when Gaby is can answer that. Now I'm going to show you more examples in O-Spec than I have with B and D, and this is, and my sense of it is this has come about because we're now seeing more data being ingested into asset management systems than previously seen. So there's a lot of clarification required around what is it that we need to do? How do we specify this? So in this particular example, so we can see that there is a pathway that I've stipulated here with that red arrow, and there is landscaping. So we want to specify the difference between that. Now, they're both made of concrete, so why not just cover it all as hard landscaping? Well, the reason that we don't cover it off as hard landscaping is that they have different purposes. So as you can see, this particular path provides a conveyance system for people to walk through the park and to access the different features. Whereas the what's marked as landscaping, and this can be one of the types, can be categorized as hard landscaping, is really a surface area that is built around the features that people can access the features easier. So it's not necessarily a conveyance path like a footpath, but it is just as important to know whether there's turf there or whether there's concrete there, particularly for useful life, maintenance purposes, and so on. Now I've brought this up previously, and so people who have seen this, who've been to our forums or to our forum last year, will probably see this. But I thought it important because where we're getting to is that there's a fine line between how we categorize assets. And so, Kelly, do you have a poll for this one? I'm assuming Kelly is around and she's just on mute. Yep. So Kelly, when you're ready, can you please put a poll up on this? So the poll is, how would you categorize this asset? Is it, there we go, is it a landscape area? Is it a boardwalk? Is it a minor structure? Is it a jetty or a pier? I'd really like everybody, whether you've had experience with O-Spec or not, it's really more holistically, how would you categorize this in your own environment? So I'll give you 15 to 20 seconds to do this so that I can then start talking about the results that we get. So one of the things that before I outline what it is, one of the things that we always stipulate, and this has come up in the previous two forums, is the importance of communication. And what I mean by that is that if you are capturing this, we need to understand the kind of maintenance regime, the kind of purpose that this is going to fulfill on. Now, you may not be in a position to go contact the asset owner to find out specifically what's going on. So it then comes back to looking at the kind of attributes. So if you answered a boardwalk, then that's correct. And the way that we looked at it is that if we compared the attributes of the boardwalk to the attributes of a landscape area or a minor structure, it doesn't give us enough detail about what it is. It doesn't give us details about the foundations. It doesn't give us details about the kind of material combined with the foundation. And of course, this fence that goes around this area would be captured as a fence in its own right. So it's really a trick question. There's two elements to this. There's the boardwalk, which is this area jutting out of this path, and the fence. Okay. Now, given the conversation that we've had, I thought that we'd throw up another poll straight away. And again, how would you categorize this feature? And please have a go at whether you're familiar with A-SPEC or not. Please have a look at the questions. And Kelly, my Teams is not behaving itself. So if you're able to maybe somehow after about another 10 or 15 seconds, tell me what the results are, that would be great. Thanks.
Okay, so it's 61% fencing feature and wall feature, 27 or 31 at fence, 8 at retaining wall, and 5 want more information.
Okay.
And someone can't see the complete photos. The poll tables overlap. You can close the poll, click the X on the poll if you need to see your screen. Yeah, maybe that works.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. All right, so I'll start with example A, there we can see that there's some stonework there and there's some railing there. It's really difficult to know whether it's a fence in the wall, whether it's a retaining wall or anything else. So the answer is more information required, which will mean have a look at the foundations of that wall and have a look at the attributes. And I'll give you an example of what I mean about the difference between whether it's a fence/wall or a retaining wall. Part B is exactly the same, right? So we have a similar type scenario, right? So part A has turned out to be a retaining wall and a fence. Part B has turned out to be two features. The lower part, the two bricks high or the 2 stones high, is a wall feature, and the railing on top is fence feature. So you've got 2 features in each of these. Now, I mentioned about finding out more information. Why is this important? Well, if we have a look at the tables for retaining walls, the blue I've highlighted, hopefully you can see blue, or it might be pale grey depending on your screen. I've highlighted the common elements between the 2 tables in blue. So you can see there's a lot of commonality. But then and then the brownish 2 layers, 2 rows on the left, which talk about average height and maximum height, as opposed to height of the fence in meters, are different again. So you can see there's quite a bit of difference as to whether you stipulate it as a fence/wall or a retaining wall. And particularly with retaining walls, there's a lot more information around drainage mechanisms and ties and restraint systems and the like, which appear to retaining walls. So if you're uncertain about it, you need to have a look at the design plans to see what the intention is and to confirm that what has been designed has been built before you specify it as either a fence/wall or a retaining wall. Okay, so speaking of walls, I don't think I've ever shared this example before, but it came through from another from a council in WA, and said, "So George, what do we do with this?" I said, "Well, would anybody like to maybe put their hand up and say how you might capture it? You know, be brave. If not, feel free to put it into the chat."
Yeah, George, it's Steve Elliott here. Can you
Hello,
hear?
Steve. Yep, great.
Yeah, my first question would be, is it on council land or private property? If it's on private property, you probably wouldn't capture it.
I like that. Okay, so let's assume it's on council land.
Okay, it's probably a wall.
Okay.
Oh, now what are we talking about? The one behind or the one in the front?
Okay, now I got your attention.
Well, it doesn't look like, to me, they don't look like retaining walls. They're just feature walls, I'd say.
Yep. Yeah, so we got a couple of examples of feature walls and a sign, right? Miller's Landing. So essentially that could be captured as a sign. Now, Steve raised a really good point, and I think that's the first step of investigating. Who will own and manage these features? If it's part of the residential area, then the asset owner doesn't need to worry about it. If it's
George?
part of, yes, Kelly?
There's a couple of other comments in the comments box. So entry statement was another
Yes, from
comment.
Casey.
And
Yeah.
what about artwork there is more than one asset here.
Yes, that's correct. It could be artwork. What we talked about with the council that gave us this example was that Miller's Landing was basically a sign. And so the feature at the back of it with the upright timbers, that could be artwork. So it comes back to what was the purpose of putting that there. And I think, Casey, you're probably correct. It was artwork, and that wasn't actually discussed at the time. But for all intents and purposes, we're talking about the grey wall not being a retaining wall, but again, finding out if it has a retaining structure or not. On the look of it, it's there for looks. I probably wouldn't. I didn't go down the path of specifying the grey as artwork. However, I think the upright timbers at the back could very easily be discovered. Could very easily be categorised as artwork. So as you can see, even in this conversation, there's things that I've been made aware of that I hadn't looked at before. So it doesn't hurt to have a conversation with the asset owner to see what the intention is. So thank you both for posting your comments. Over the last couple of versions, we've started putting in conditional. And this is becoming more prevalent or more common. Essentially, it is an if statement. If this situation exists, then do that. So it's important to read the condition, what the condition is. If you don't understand what the condition is, or if it's vague or ambiguous, then please contact GISA for clarification, or go to your peers to see what they've done around that. I've had some questions to say, well, do we just add the default value? The answer is no. It's a conditional field. It's a mandatory field. It needs to have a value in there. In this particular instance, when we're talking about unique ID, there is no default value. So I just want to be clear about that. Why? Because the condition is if the asset owner gives you the ID, use that. Otherwise, create your own. And they're arbitrary numbers. They are really an audit trail back to this data. Street name. It's conditional. If the asset sits in the street, then put in the street name. And using the Australian New Zealand standard for the correct street suffix type. If it's not in a street, then apply the default, which is NA, not applicable. You will notice that we do not use unknown in the DDS versions. Would anyone like to say why we don't use unknown in the DDS versions for all new assets? Feel free just to take yourself off mute and share it with us. Okay, so the reason that we don't use unknown for new assets is because we know everything about them. Thank you, Gabby. If it was surveyed, how can it be unknown? If it was designed and built, how can it be unknown? Whereas if we're using the existing version and we're turning up after the fact, there are some elements that are unknown, and that's an applicable value that can be entered into the existing when you're using the existing version. Now, some people are thinking, oh, maybe I'll just use the existing version instead of the DDS version. I think you might get a surprise when the data gets evaluated. So the last FAQ. And again, this isn't just specific to O-Spec, but it's something that comes up time and time again. Now, do I make assumptions? Do I just use the defaults? Do I leave? So this is my first question, right? Do I leave it blank and hope it's not included? Trick question. It's none of the above. The intention is if you don't have all the details, then chase up with the lead consultant and request they provide the details. And this is a common conversation that we have with people who are collating the data, that I can't get the data from the consultant. If you cannot get the data from the consultant and you're only part of the delivery mechanism, then make sure that when you complete the certification form, that you provide it. You provide a comment that's, sorry, you don't provide it. You provide the certification form with a comment of where you got the data from and what data has not been provided. However, it still needs to be provided, and the asset owner may come back to the consultant and say, please give us this information. So the second question. This revolves around an education process. The answer, by the way, is C. The specs are the specs. They've been agreed to and they've been endorsed, and that's what is expected to be delivered. And I know of instances where some authorities say, oh, listen, can you just reconfigure this in a different way or just add some extra stuff? It's not O-Spec plus George's addendum. It's not O-Spec plus John's addendum. It's O-Spec. If people want something outside of O-Spec, then let them know if you're prepared to do it, one, and two, that there will probably be a cost involved. And just very briefly, we've started, this is an example of D-Spec where we've started mapping out a data model showing the different relationships with the tables. We'll do more work on this. And if you're interested in this, great. If not, no drama. It's not going to have an impact on you. You know, just let us know. I do want to spend the last few minutes that I have just talking about some governance and what I mean by governance. Asset and asset data handover checklist. So we've created, well, let me go back a step. Why is this so important? We found it's a great way to identify exactly what is expected at handover. And to the point where you can use it as part of subdivision development assessment, you can use it as part of a capital works assessment, and at the end of it, there's an area there that both parties sign off on. We use this extensively with the projects, the bigger projects that we do, so our team knows what to look for when the drawings are handed to us to collate into the A-SPEC format. We also have a consultant guide that we've developed. If you are, and this is specifically for the authorities, the councils and other authorities that are here, this is a guide that we've used, and we initially we found this guide was created by Open Spatial, one of our associate companies who does a lot of work in the A-SPEC realm, and we asked them for their permission, and we've basically modified it to accept to accommodate A-SPEC, the A-SPEC environment. So there's a table of contents, and it goes for about 12 or 15 pages and so on, covers things like the tolerance report, and we provide a guide as to what each submission will require, etc., etc. more importantly, it has the checklist in there that can actually be pre-filled. In this case, I've got an example of what Central Coast Council did when they put their water treatment plant upgrade project out to tender. So we went through and we worked with them to identify all the different kinds of assets. And now the consultants that had a look at this can now determine if that's actually a requirement as part of the deliverable. And then they tick off on the right-hand side. They both sign off, and that becomes the deliverable. We talk about the quality report. That's also in the document, and it's also in every one of the specs. This is about providing certainty and confidence, and it removes time and effort to verify what's been changed. We know that we know that there are a lot of changes that occur out in the field. Some of them are recorded, some are not, for various reasons. The intention of this is to bring it to the fore so that whoever is checking the data for compliance with A-SPEC, they can see if any of the changes that have been agreed to have actually been included in the data. We talk about asset recording principles, and it's really important. We've looked at every asset type and we've categorized it according to horizontal and vertical precision. Again, it provides certainty and confidence around the level of data. Now, these are guides for the data, for the asset recording. It's not a guide for what happens when you're building the asset. Those tolerances are already in place and specified in different design and construction requirements. This is what the certification form looks like, to take into account that, you know, there's more to it than just this. I've just focused on the projection area because there's some data now that is being specified in ATRF, the Australian Terrestrial Reference Framework, which is more dynamic and therefore need to know the start and end times of the observations, so that people can address what the variations are. Highly technical, but really important that there's a record of it. Again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to put them in. Gaby, I've eaten into your time by 3 minutes, but you're going to get it back. So don't worry about running out of time. We will give you a 3-minute warning. So just keep going until you get the warning. Perfect. And then you better get on your bike. So thanks very much. I'll put myself on mute for the moment, and we will move on to Tech Talk with Gaby.
Thank you for that, George. Sharing my screen and just quickly putting a slide on. Right. So I'm going to start off by just very quickly talking about GDB Hub. I've spoken about GDB Hub before. It's a validation portal that we've developed. We developed this together with One Spatial, and it allows us to do validation at different levels. So there's a schema level validation, and that's the validation that validates relationships between features, both spatial relationships and attribute relationships. So that's things like if you have anything that's associated with a particular building, we need to know that it's inside, say, the footprint, and we do that kind of validation. So that's at a schema level. Table level, that's the spatial types, the datums, the naming conventions, what fields are in or not in. And then attribute level, are the fields complete? Is the data that you've entered, does it come from a code list if it has to be in a code list, etc. We have a correction feature, so it does validation, but if you've got a particular way of working within your own organization, you can submit your data, set up the mapping your way of working to A-SPEC, and the correction feature will then correct what it can and automatically spit out data that complies, even though your structures may not all comply completely. We did have a trial period, and that's over now, and then we're in full production. And just wanted to put it out there. It's about $500 to start off. And if you want to know more, you can just contact myself or Andre from One Spatial, and we'll take it from there. Right. I'm going to dive into my technical side of things, and what you see on the screen at the moment is data that I've imported from DXF. Now, we often get data we've got a team of people who do data migration, data capture, various services around A-SPEC, and this is one of the issues that they often get is having to work with DXF data because the DXF data doesn't always behave like you think it should. And I wanted to talk about some of those issues here. So this redstone that I've got up there that's part of a DXF that was imported. You can see that it gives me the DXF, and the data actually comes in as point lines and polygons. But for each point line and polygon, all the layers are just imported as an attribute. So if I looked at the attributes for say the lines, I've just right-clicked on the line. If I looked at the attributes there, you'll see that the layer, there's all the layers and the subclasses. So these are all polylines or circles. There should be some circles. So there's a few circles. Tells me the attributes, but the data comes in. This is the key thing. The data actually doesn't come in as separate layers. It comes in as a point, a line, or a polygon, and the layer is just an attribute that's associated with that. So part of what we have to do is we've got to separate those things out and make sure that we are able to do the work that we want to do. So I'm going to focus specifically on one data type, and in order to do that, I'll just double click on the line entities, and I'm going to create. By the way, it always comes in as rule-based, and I don't want to have the rule-based, so I want to have a categorized analysis. And you also see that I'll first do the categorization. So I'm just going to categorize according to layer, classify, apply, and click OK. And you can see that I've got 3 different layers. There's our trees, our grass, and the stage boundary. Now, interesting thing to note, these lines, it reports that this is a red and that one is a purple, but everything here is yellow, and that's a bit confusing. So why would that be? So all these lines or a lot of these lines are in yellow, all right? And the reason for that is that when you import data from a DXF, a lot of the times the import mechanism will try to map colors and various things based on attributes that come from AutoCAD. And if I come down to this, I'm sorry, you just want to give me a second. No, I can't clear it today. What's going on? I'm missing something. If I change the master color, Well, I'm going to just go back to this one, and I go to the properties of that, and I need Michael all of a sudden, because he's the one that does this all the time, and I can't seem to clear that parameter. I'll just move on. Don't know why that's not clearing. I can show you over here. Well, I hope I can. So sometimes with labels, this is what I was looking for. So sometimes you'll see that there's like a yellow epsilon highlighted, and all these yellow things means that it's actually data that was that's forced from the original data. And if I wanted to clear that, then I'd have to go and just go hit clear. Hit on all these things and hit it clear. Now I'm not going to do that for everything. I don't necessarily have to do that, but just if you want to, if you find any attributes that's not clearing, then just go and double click, look at the properties, and select clear. Okay. So the other issue that we find is if I look at the data here, this is landscapes. Okay, I want to take off some of these, and I'll take off the trees. So I'm only looking at landscape polygons, and those landscape polygons that you see there, they're lines, but they're supposed to be closed polygons. And the reason for that is when the data came in, remember when I showed you that data was actually stored as polylines, and polylines convert to they convert to polylines or line entities in AutoCAD. Now, there's a lot of attributes that come with it, so I'll just quickly show those again. And you can see a lot of these things: the pen style, there's a font, there's angles, there's a whole heap of things. These are all the AutoCAD, CAD related, DXF related attributes. I don't need all of those. I need the layer, and I might need the color, and that's really what's the only bits that's useful for me. So what I often do is, in order to get rid of the attributes, but also in order to work with these as polygons, I'll go create an empty polygon entity. So I'm just going to do that, and I'm going to call it A-SPEC poly, and make sure that it's a polygon entity. Set the projection correct. This is the other thing. The projection doesn't come through, and I should have set my projection before the time, but I know that it's 7855. And I'm going to add two attributes. I'm going to add a layer attribute, and I'm going to add a color attribute. And I'm going to spell it according to the American way, because that's how it's spelled inside the DXF. All right. So I've now created an empty A-SPEC polygon. And I just want to fix that spelling mistake. I've created that empty A-SPEC polygon. And what I'll do now is I'll just zoom out a little bit and select everything. And I'm going to copy it. Select everything. And now I can copy it. And I'll just paste it into my the polygon that I've actually created. And I should turn this off. So it didn't actually paste. Why is everything going crazy with me today? I'll just copy all of that. This is the danger when you're looking at live demos. I'll copy everything and then clear that. Go in here and paste it. and yet it doesn't show up. And I feel like a bit of a failure here. Oh, I know exactly what the problem is. I should have set my CRSs, and I didn't do that. I actually said that I should have done that, and I didn't do that. So don't make the mistakes that I've made.
Nothing like a live demonstration to keep you on your toes, Gaby.
That's right, George. And then having to think what went wrong, what went wrong.
Yes.
Okay.
Passport work.
So, all right, let's just see what we have over here. So I've got data, but the data will be wrong. So I'm just going to delete all that data and just make sure that I have what I want. I'll just zoom out a little bit. And then select again. There's so much more that I wanted to show. I don't think I'm going to have time for that. Copy that. And if I paste it correctly, and if I've done everything correct, then now they'll show up as polygons. Copy. Okay.
Gaby, you still have
What I
5 minutes.
Okay. One of the other tricks I wanted to show, and people, there's a lot of tricks that I wanted to show in terms of all of this. I'm going to show one more, and I'll just address that. The issue I have over here is now, because blocks were inserted on the original, those blocks come out as all these extra little polygons. And how do I get rid of them? I can go and individually go and select each of them and then get rid of it. But there are other trick ways. You just have to think out the box. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add something called area. I'm just going to add an area. I'll calculate the area. So $area always calculates the area of the current as a new entity. And then look at the attributes. If I sort, then I'll find that, I now know this, but you can find what was the size of those polygons. And if I select everything that's 4 square meters, I'll just move this out of the way and I go and investigate, you'll see that everything that's selected is one of those polygons. Just want to make sure that this polygon over here has not been selected. Yeah, that's all good. And I can now delete those. And that's it. I've got my polygons and I've got it cleaned up. The next bit I wanted to show you was how to associate the attributes, because that's also pretty straightforward. But I can only do that if I don't faff about and forget to set my projection. So a very key lesson there. The lesson I didn't want to teach you is don't forget to go and set your projections. I'll stop it at that point. All right. Over to you, George.
Or me.
Or you.
Thanks, Gaby. That was really good. We now have our first community presentation from Brendan McNamara from RapidMap. So over to you, Brendan, and welcome.
Hi all, sorry I wasn't ready. I thought I was a few minutes. For those who don't know me, I'll just a quick introduction. Brendan McNamara is my name. I'm the General Manager and Senior Consultant at RapidMap Services. We specialise in asset data capture and condition inspections. And I guess many of our clients are dealing with D-SPEC and O-SPEC. And I'd just like to talk a little bit today, probably not from a real technical background, it's more from how we work with the clients in looking at their D-SPEC and O-SPEC requirements. So I will just attempt to share my screen. Hopefully you can see a blue background PowerPoint there.
Yep.
Sorry about that. With D-SPEC, I think it's really common when clients include D-SPEC requirements in their project specifications. This is something that comes up a lot. They say, well, look, we want our data to be D-SPEC compliant. And typically they know already a lot about their pits and pipes. They know what they want to collect. This, you know, typically the majority of the focus is on pits and pipes. Additionally, you know, a few other assorted assets such as end walls and culverts. Some of the rural councils would be looking at open drains and channels. There's a few channels in the suburban areas, but mostly rural. But it's a fairly small list, and people have to get their head around it with stormwater assets. So D-SPEC actually sets out the requirements for drainage assets really well, and because the mainstream components or assets in stormwater drainage is fairly limited, well known, it's easy for clients to deal with what they need to know. So they generally have a pretty good idea of what they want, and I suppose, you know, typically it's all right. Pits, what sort of pit is it? And what sort of lids it got? Length, width, depth, those type of things. Potentially they might want to know, has it got steps or has it got litter baskets? But it's fairly straightforward for the pits. The pipes, similarly, they'd want to know which pits it connects to, so the MIDs of those pits. They'd want to know the inverts of the pipe. They'd want to know the diameter of the pipe and the material, and potentially things like lining and joint types and stuff like that. So it's pretty straightforward, and it's fairly easy to work with the clients in these regards. And we would typically point out anything they haven't already thought of. And I suppose there's two main purposes that they do the work in stormwater drainage, and that's for asset management purposes, but it's also for flood modelling. So we recommend to clients that if you're looking at asset management only, well, you don't need a lot more to cover for the flood modelling. So, you know, important things like accurate invert levels and pit sizes and pipe dimensions and things like that, but you don't need a lot more to get the flood modelling data out than you want purposes. So yeah, I think the D-SPEC requirements is fairly easy to work with, and most of the clients, as I say, they've got a pretty good idea. Open space assets, though, it's a bit of a different story. It's not very common to have O-SPEC included in a project specification. And why is that? Well, I guess I'm sort of reading between the lines a bit, but I think in open spaces, you've got such a massive variety of asset types. And for many of those assets, the only thing they've got in common is the fact that they're in open spaces. So it's such a huge range of different assets occur. And as well as that, because the assets are so varied, the list of attributes that people want to collect is also really long and varied. The O-SPEC is really comprehensive in the list. It's got, and it's equally comprehensive with the list of attributes required for these assets or these asset groups. So it lists many, many pages of asset groups and potential attributes, varied things from amenities, fences and walls, minor structures, playing fields, playgrounds, playground and exercise equipment, boardwalks, bins, gates, etc., etc., etc. And as you can imagine, the things you need to know about a fence or a wall are very different than what you need to know about a piece of playground equipment or a gate or a bin or a boardwalk or whatever it might be. So all those pages through O-SPEC give you a very good idea of potential attributes. But I think the main issue the clients have is the fact that there's too much information. They can't really get their head around it all. There's pages and pages. How do I put this all together and how do I work out what I need to know? What a lot of them have done, whether intentionally or unintentionally, they've actually applied some of the components of O-Spec into their specifications and their data models. They probably just haven't labelled it that way. As I say, we don't actually see the words O-Spec included in many specifications. Well, so how do we help those clients out? I guess what we do is we use our experience and knowledge to advise the clients. I mean, we've been doing this work since 1994. I've been there since 1994, so I'm waiting for my gold watch next year. What we do with the clients, we suggest the most common assets, and sometimes this involves assets they may not have thought of. They obviously know the main things they have. All right, we've got sporting fields and associated sporting equipment and infrastructure. We've got shelters and other minor structures. We've got seats, bins, drinking fountains, barbecues, all these types of things. They're aware of those, but they may not think of other things that are important assets in the park. Little things that sometimes are very important, like backflow devices. They never think of that one, but it's an important asset to maintain their irrigation assets, and little bits and pieces like that. So we suggest to clients, we have long lists of assets that we can come up with, and based on where the client is situated, they may or may not have that. So if they're by the coast, they might have some marine assets. If they're well inland, well, they're not going to have those, and we don't include them in our suggestions. With them and suggest the attributes that are most commonly used, and these are set out, asset by asset, the typical attributes that you may want to look at. I suppose we also point out what attributes aren't very valuable, or what attributes you're unlikely to be able to establish in the field. Perhaps a good example of that is we're often asked to collect manufacturer details and model details. Now, what comes back when we do that is a lot of unknown, because there's not many assets in the field which actually have a model number or a manufacturer on them. Some of the playground items do, occasionally a few other assets, but typically most assets don't have them. So we advise the client, rather than coming back with they've got a manufacturer or model number and 1,000 that don't, they're probably better off to ignore that. It's often the case too that when they replace these assets, they're not going to replace them with what was there. They're going to standardise, and so all the seats we're going to put back, the new seats are all going to be of this type and model. Or all the bins we're going to use, the bin surrounds, we're going to use this type of model. Assets that are existing in the field might have been there for 20 or 30 years, and who knows what changes have happened over that time. So some of those things are not so important. And how we deal with these assets and attributes, we prepare a matrix for the client, and I'll show you one in a moment. We set out a matrix of assets and attributes, and we feed that back to the client to give them some ideas of what we advise, and then they can make some adjustments to that matrix. Say, well, we also want this, or we don't want that. And when that's all approved, then we can actually do our setup and commence field inspection. So I'll give you a little bit of a look at the typical matrix. So there's a typical matrix that we would do. It's just got a long list of assets down the left-hand side. I hope you can read that okay. I might just blow it up a little bit. We suggest what sort of object it should be, so whether we capture it as a point or as a polyline or a polygon. And then we look at typical attributes that you collect. So some things have a type, others don't. Most things have a material. If it's a polygon feature, it needs an area, or if it's a linear feature, it needs a length. Things have a width. Other things need to know how many. So how many hot plates are on a barbecue? How many hoops in a bicycle rack? Or how many benches on a picnic setting? These type of things. Capacity, what's the capacity of a bin or a water tank? And then little bits and pieces like if it's a drinking fountain, has it got a dog bowl attached to it, or has it got a separate tap? If it's a barbecue, has it got a tap on it? Even things, I think this comes out of O-Spec. If it's a boardwalk, is it above water? So we set out these things to try and make it simple for the clients to determine what they want to capture. We also break the materials down a little bit. They often get put back into something a little bit more like material one or something like that. But we look at materials of the base of assets, or we look at the pole or the post material. We look at roof materials or frame materials. This makes it a little bit clear as what we're actually capturing it from both the inspector's point of view in the field, what do I need to capture about this asset, and from the data going back to the client so we can standardise it. The worst thing that happens in data capture is by saying we're going to get a material and you start off and say, well, it's steel. And then you say it's steel and timber, and it's steel and timber and concrete. And already you can make a lot of combinations of that by placing them in different orders. And when you get the data at the end, the council tries to do some sorting of data and finds out they've got, 300, material types when it just hasn't been standardised. So we break them down into individual materials. We look at condition, photos, things like that. So that's just a bit of an example of how data structures are set up for council based on O-Spec. There's a few little things that we do that are probably not exactly compliant with O-Spec, and so an example of that is barbecues. So I think in O-Spec they're set out from memory. I think they're as a electric barbecue or a gas barbecue or a wood fire barbecue. We're trying to restrict the types, both for our purpose of capturing the data, but also for the client to be able to try and limit how many types. So we'd capture a barbecue with a type of electric, gas, wood fired, etc. So that's sort of how we work through and help the client establish what they want. There's probably a few more things down the bottom. You can see the list goes on. Some of the lists we try and standardise as much as possible, and we try and help them a little bit by clients typically say to us, we don't want too many asset types in our asset management system. So, and we don't want too many assets in there. So we try and combine a few things. So, and a couple of examples of that is bollards is a good example. We capture bollards as individual things or a bollard fence. So if there's more than 3 bollards in a row or 3 or more and they're all the same and they're evenly spaced, we capture them as a bollard fence. So there's one bollard fence and it's got 100 bollards in it. It's not 100 assets coming back to the client to say, these are all bollards. So it helps them manage a little bit and also doesn't overload their system too. A few other things we do just helps to bring down the number of assets and standardise things. So I think an example of that would be a playground. So all type and the edging type as attributes of the playground, especially the edging. I don't think there's any need to create a separate asset for the edging that runs around the playground. It's just an attribute of the playground. You already have the playground as a polygon. The edging runs around the outside. You can establish the length of it from the perimeter of the polygon. It just, once again, helps to standardise that. I've probably used up most of my time. I think that's pretty much what I wanted to discuss with everyone today, just to outline how to work with clients, in relation to O-Spec and D-Spec. And I think once clients get something like this matrix back, it helps them to well, it just makes it a bit easy for them. It doesn't overcomplicate it. and they don't have to worry about working their way through, dozens of lists of various asset types and potential attributes. So,
Great.
pass
Thank
it over.
you very much, Brendan. It's a very informative presentation. Anyone has any questions for Brendan, you can either pop them in the chat, or we do have a quick minute before we move on to Jack's presentation. So if you would like to take yourself off mute and ask a question, feel free. Otherwise, I will move on with introducing Jack Richardson from the City of Mandurah. So welcome, Jack, and thank you for accepting our invitation to present. And we look forward to hearing what you've got to say. Over to you.
Thanks, guys. Can everybody hear me and see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Great. So good morning. I'm Jack from the City of Mandurah in Western Australia. I'm the coordinator of strategic asset management. So thank you for everyone for attending today, and I just want to basically walk through the city's experience with integrating O-Spec into our asset management systems, but also just to provide some pointers and takeaways to organisations that are about to sort of embark on a similar journey. I know a lot of councils are changing their providers when it comes to asset management, so hopefully we can help out there. I'll also just discuss some of the pros and cons of using O-Spec and some key takeaways, and yeah, I can take any questions during or at the end. Either is fine. So I'm hoping Kelly might have a poll ready for this one. If not, we can perhaps come back to it. So basically, I just wanted to start the session with a community poll surrounding the accessibility requirements for the amenities asset category. So Kelly, do you have a poll that we can just ask the community on for this one, or do you want to create one and come back to it?
I can create one. What is the question that you wanted?
So the question is basically, should we incorporate, and again, obviously not, we've probably missed the boat on this year's updates, but should we incorporate an attribute for amenities to say whether they are accessible, friendly or not? So we've just got a couple of photos here of a couple of assets at the city that obviously are accessible, friendly. And where this sort of came about was reception calling me and asking to say that basically there was a couple coming down from Perth for a barbecue, and they just wanted to know where our accessible barbecues were located so that they could come down and enjoy a lunch. Now, from looking at the data itself, I wasn't able to obviously give them much feedback. I had to go on all the thumbnail photos attached to the assets to sort of determine, well, which ones could a wheelchair sort of get up to, and then give them that feedback. So that's where
just to interrupt you quickly there, Jack.
Sure.
Quick responses coming in, 100% yes so far.
Yeah, that's great, and I think this is a great example of how GEEs operate. So they provide opportunities for us as the data users to constantly iterate on the data attributes and keep up with the changing requirements of the built and the natural environment. So no, that's great. So just as an introduction, changing asset management software. So I just want to acknowledge that luckily for me, I wasn't at the city when we transitioned from our old provider, which was Asset Finder, to what we now use, which is Technology One's One Council. But I could definitely speak to some of the lessons learned as part of that process. The City of Mandurah were using Asset Finder as their asset management software solution, but in 2020, they transitioned this across to One Council. This consisted of 137,000 assets being migrated, around 18,000 of which were in the open space asset class. So what did this require? This required the city to build out the One Council asset configuration for all the classes that we were going to hold data for. So the configuration is basically the back end of one council, which includes all the columns, rows within a spreadsheet, but also includes creating the various selection types, codes, user fields from A-SPEC. The selection types are the mandatory attributes that relate to the A-SPEC code lists, whereas user fields are just the free text fields that we use, like the make and model. So with one council, we get to choose from 20 selection types and 20 custom fields to provide the data attributes. So that's just something to bear in mind if you are consulting, if you are bringing in across data sets for things like trees, where from memory we had to cut some of the attributes there because there just wasn't enough slots in the selection types to fill all of the attributes that R-SPEC would require. So what I would say is to audit and check your data for obvious errors, obviously, before doing an import. Unfortunately, the city imported across 12,000 assets that didn't have any spatial mapping data. So that became an exercise in of itself to find and map those missing assets. I would say that to ensure that your migration is done slowly and accurately, and preferably with an oversight from the platform provider to feed back to you guys as you're going through the process. I would also ensure that you don't have any data attributes that are replicated. For example, the city's data structure that was decided upon basically was to allow for a field, as we can see in here, which was subdivision. But then we also get subdivision being called up as an attribute in R-SPEC as well. So what it ends up is that we obviously have this data twice, but just, yeah, this is on our to-do list to tidy this up and get rid of the R-SPEC field, and obviously just it's reflected here, so we don't need it twice. Just something to bear in mind so you don't have to post-process that. And lastly, with your data structures, I would suggest considering any asset management plan or strategy structures so that you can preset those as you load in the data. So that will allow you to quickly parse data based on the asset management plan that the data falls within. It also will allow the asset custodians or the data users to also see their responsibilities as it pertains to asset management plans and the like. And another, just a quick one on getting buy-in from your asset users and the data users, I should say, is to they all love photos, so having a thumbnail photo does seem to get much better buy-in with the your asset custodians. So some of the pros to O-SPEC. So O-SPEC obviously provides a uniform and consistent approach to the data requirements. It's well established with developers and surveyors in WA, so it works really well for us. It's decentralized, so obviously the whole community of members can contribute to its progression and improvement, and again, based on the changing requirements of the built and natural environment. So you can also move assets from one class to another, which I must admit that we do. So if you find you're going to get better asset outcomes, you can move the assets across the specifications. An example of this might be lakes. So a lake asset might have originally gone in as an O-SPEC landscaping item, but your custodians might inform you, for example, that stormwater actually discharges into that lake. So then you can migrate that across to D-SPEC to provide more relevant data. The only issue we have at the city with doing migrations such as that is that when we set up an open space asset, it comes with an account string that is specific to the open space accounts and financial strings. So if we do make changes across asset classes, we do have to inform finance. So that's just something to bear in mind. So the pros obviously are to get better data outcomes. So I've got an example here with flagpoles. So we used to house flagpoles in the amenities asset class. We also had osprey poles that the city installs for our ospreys. And again, we actually put those under minor structures. So having this new attribute for pole and post type allows us to migrate them particular assets into the pole post type asset category and get better data outcomes. Now, granted, we obviously will create it's got flagpole, but for an osprey pole, we're going to obviously add an extra code and description. We don't often use the C comment field for any of our. We'll just keep building upon these codes and descriptions in the selection codes. So obviously the last point there is just the changing needs of the data, which we touched upon earlier with the poll, where obviously as the built and natural environment evolve, the data requirements surrounding that also are going to need to evolve, and for us as a community, we can all feed into improving that. So just onto the cons, and when I say cons, George, I do mean cons in the best possible light. So there can never be a full consensus on such a complex ecosystem, and there's always going to be inevitable sort of overlaps. So I've got art versus science, and this is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek joke, but based on real-life sort of feedback and discussions with our arts and culture team. So just because we have an O-Spec submission for public art, as in a bollard on a stirrup with a painted top, the public art, our arts and culture department might not see that the same way. So just something to bear in mind, that the resolution that we had to this was that instead of removing this from public art and trying to make it fit a square peg in a round hole, we're just going to create a new selection type that would be something like, we'll call it a landscaping feature. It still sits under art, but the public art guys can then filter out the data to what they deem to be public art and how they want to manage that based on their strategies that they're running themselves. Another pet peeve, let's say, and Brendan covered up on this, is just around the fences and bollards, can be both lines and points. Now, obviously, we've also got the fact that bollards around a park site, we may be classed as a traffic management device to stop vehicles getting on the park and doing donuts and whatever. I mean, at the city, our bollards are managed by the park team, and obviously are sat on a park site, so we class them as a fence, a bollard fence, and a bit like Brendan, we would create a line string to represent the data, and then have our primary dimension as each and the number of bollards in there. That, however, does get a little bit annoying where we have a single bollard that we don't necessarily think that should be represented as a line. We would like to have that as a point. But again, happy to further discuss that. Time. So it does take time to fully understand the O-Spec configuration and A-Spec as a whole, and where the assets may best fit. So there, like I say earlier, you can move them across if you do find they're better suited elsewhere. You're never going to be 100% across all of the specifications, so it is just a case of going in and getting your head in it and coming back out and constantly referring back to it. And just one last one is coastal assets, and probably a discussion to have with George outside of this is just my personal view is that they could be perhaps better served as a standalone specification. So some of the key takeaways. So whilst you may want to chop and change the data that you receive, when just make sure that you keep obviously the original record from any developer submission. So you've got that to come back to. Be really clear on who is and who will be using the data and what they need to make informed decisions. So an example of this might be for capital works, when the project managers come up to you and say, what do you need for the ASCON? I mean, my common response is, well, what data would you like to receive back? Would you be doing this project again? What would you like to send out? So if that includes things like, aside from the data side, it might be that they want to put in the request for quote in the data submission, and you attach that to the asset or the work order, so that that can be pulled at a later date and they can regurgitate that information as opposed to creating it from scratch. Are you duplicating data? So this is a tricky one from both finance and asset management perspective, and actually funny that George used this example earlier. So if we look at boardwalks, the metadata confirms the rail type and rail material. So if we're valuing this boardwalk with a rail and a balustrade around it, then we don't really want a secondary asset created around the perimeter to represent the fence, of which we would value again. It's sort of we'd sort of double dipping a little bit there if we're valuing this as a whole, and then we're saying there's also a line of fence balustrade around the outside edge that we're also going to value. Well, we're valuing it twice, so I do think that needs perhaps more consideration as to how we parse them things out. And a bit like George said as well, is that the boardwalk itself may have different, well, it will have different maintenance requirements to the balustrade, and obviously the balustrade is a really important health and safety feature of the boardwalk. So having it as a separate asset may benefit in some ways, but it may create negatives in another. Subdivisional works process. So have a plan of how you think of how this process is going to run. If you haven't set this up already, which department and what roles are responsible for each stage of the process. So who's going to audit the incoming data? Obviously, we can do that. You can manage that in-house, but there's also external software solutions like the GDV hub that's available. But again, that's a decision that your organisation will need to make. Capital works. So just provide this little bit of an example. It's an area of focus for us as a city to provide capital works with A-SPEC data being included in them. Admittedly, at this stage, it's a watered down version of A-SPEC and we collect, but we do have a survey team. We're lucky to have a survey team at the city that are happy to pick up additional attributes when they're doing their pickups. And also they're also looking at always improving the data quality that they're going to give back as part of the as constructed plans, which is great. But again, it's also imperative to set up processes for the completed capital projects to ensure that the ASCONs are getting submitted, and also ASCON assets that you've currently got in your database are getting disposed, and keeping obviously the data accurate. And I'd say that receiving ASCONs, like most of the council participants here, getting ASCONs to be submitted, it's probably one of the biggest challenges that you're going to face. Maintenance schedules. So once you've received and added assets, well, what next? So at the city, we have basically work orders that come in with the ASCONs. We attach the assets that we create to the work order. The work order then gets reassigned to the finance department, who then commission the assets that require commissioning. Finance then reassign the work order to our operations team, who then add any maintenance schedules to the assets that require it. So if we've got a new barbecue, it needs to go onto the barbecue cleaning contract. So they will add a maintenance schedule for the barbecue cleaning. If it's a minor structure like a shelter, well, at the city, we're a coastal town city, so we pressure clean our shelters on a sort of a 6-monthly basis. So again, that asset would get added to a pressure cleaning maintenance schedule, and that sort of rounds out the cycle as well. And lastly, my point on the takeaways is George as a soundboard. If you do sign up to A-SPEC, if you're not already, then you do get access to George and his team. George is super friendly, patient, and always happy to lend an ear. when you need to bounce ideas off him. I've got so many examples that I could share. So that's credit to George and his team, and thanks to them. And just to close out, just if there's any questions that you guys may have, I'll do my best. But thank you to all the attendees and for Giza for inviting me to speak, and enjoy the rest of the forum.
Thanks, Jack. That was a very good presentation. Does anybody have any questions they would like to ask Jack? You can please put them in the chat, or you can just interrupt the next speaker, which is George, who is from Giza. I really like that new naming convention, George.
Yeah.
George.
Well, you know, I could be called an old geezer, which is
I wasn't
fine.
going to say anything.
No. See, Kelly, somebody does like interacting with me.
And also, Jack, there were some spatial issues. Do you want to just elaborate a little bit about that? Or Anthony, do you want to take yourself off speaker and elaborate on your question for Jack?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I can see that now. So the spatial issues were that we had assets and they had no mapping. So we knew the park or the street that they were in, but we had to rely on a skeleton amount of data to try and track them down. So that may have included, obviously, going to the various parks to physically find, well, there's only one retaining wall in here, and is it that length? And then obviously getting that mapped. So yeah, that was the spatial issue. So it was a result of bringing over data from Asset Finder that didn't contain any spatial data, if that makes sense.
Great, thank you for providing some further detail around that. I'm going to hand you back to George from Old Giza, and he is going to give you the wrap up, talk about some dates, code lists, spreadsheets, APIs, etc. So whilst he is doing that, I will also just throw up a couple of quick polls. If you could please answer these polls, because it's about rating our presentations to make sure that we're on track and giving you guys what you need in terms of information. So over to you, George.
Thanks, Kelly, and thank you both, Brendan and Jack, for the time that you put into putting your presentations together. It's always great to get different perspectives, and today was a really good example how we had perspective from a council after they got the data, and from a consultant about what's involved in making sure that the council ends up with the data thereafter. So they're really great, and you know, our intention of having these speakers from the community present was really fulfilled on today, and as has been for the last two forums. So the wrap up. Okay, release dates. Well, the specs are on the website. I did a very soft launch. It was so soft I didn't tell you, but I've been talking about it the last few weeks, that from the 4th of September that these specs are now available. So what does that look like? So I'm going to tempt fate and do a live thing. So when you log in, if you haven't got a login, first thing to do is go to this contact form at the top next to the search box, fill the details in, and if you're new, there's a particular process, and you'll hear from Melissa from our organisation. She'll take you through that process. If your organisation has already been participating with A-SPEC, then you'll inherit the same permissions that your organisation has. And so it makes it easy then. You don't need to ask which specs, you just ask for access. So getting back to logging in. So once you log in, it's no good. Okay, so once you log in, you'll come to a page like this. Okay, and previously we asked you to search for the specs looking at the proposed changes area. And this was under here. So we are removing these links from here. What you will see is going back to the original login space. Click on this area here, specifications, and you'll come to an area here which outlines all the specifications that are available. Slightly different format. You'll see that we've got specific things for A-SPEC, the introduction overview, the code list, and you'll be able to access download the different specifications that your organization subscribes to or has access to from here. Now, we've also loaded some sample data. It's in two formats, shapefile and geopackage. Feel free to take which one you like. It's really up to you which format you want, and having a GIS environment, you'll be able to put it into other formats that are required. Now, we talk about sample data. So what is it that you're likely to receive when you look at the sample data? Okay, I'm quickly going to jump into QGIS. Okay, so from a QGIS environment, I've just brought up a Google Maps just for some context. Now, when I bring in all the layers, essentially the sample data has been created so that we've got examples of each of the kinds of assets that are in O-Spec, and this exists for all the assets. So if we start looking at this particular area here, we also have some example data in here. When you're looking at space, one of the biggest issues that we find is setting the data up, setting your fields up. So what we've done here is that it is in the structure, the attributes are in the structure that's specified in the specs. So that's what you can expect, excuse me, from accessing the sample data. I know with speaking with one particular consultant, they actually use the sample data to create their forms that they then use to go out in the field, and it saves them a lot of time with doing that. So you know, it's really great to see the different kinds of innovations that occur out of doing that. So I just wanted to show you that, because ultimately this is the kind of package that you're going to receive. Okay, so the phase-in period ended 4th of September. What did that mean? That means that when we first put the specs on the website in their draft format was in April. We then looked at how much time would be required for people to make those changes. Now, is it a hard and fast rule? No, it's not, because it comes back to your organization. So if you're an asset owner, then it's important to look at what the timing is going to be for when you transition into the new specs. So, you know, understanding what the changes in, what the new attributes are. If we're going to add that attribute, that accessibility attribute that Jack has proposed and kindly requested a poll. Unanimously, it was a yes. So what we'll do from now on is have a look at which attributes, which assets that accessibility attribute will go onto. So Jack, your homework isn't over yet. I'm coming back to you with more questions about the proposed attributes, and then we will we'll distribute that, or we'll circulate that to the community and make sure that they're okay with what assets are covered. Okay, we've just gone through accessing the specs. Okay, for people who are who haven't been to either of our B-SPEC or D-SPEC forums, we've been talking about a new specification, and you know what they say, all work and no play makes George a dull boy. So we've come up with the term A-SPEC. And it wasn't actually my term, it was actually Philip's term. So he can talk about what you can expect. And I'll stop there because my wife tells me that it's no point me making jokes because I'm the only one that really laughs at them, and they're not that funny anyway. So, but in all seriousness, the specification A-SPEC came about from, we've got an EV charging station. This may or may not end up in A-SPEC, but for things like bulk fuel, where there is combustible liquids, there isn't a particular specification that we can find a home for fuel tanks, for example, or combustible liquids. So we are looking at creating A-SPEC at no extra cost to the community, and putting in asset types like this one. And we may even do it. We don't have an energy spec at the moment, and we're considering whether we start by putting the solar panels, solar farms into A-SPEC to start with, because we're starting to see a proliferance of solar farms now that asset owners are building and managing. In the event that we go to an E-SPEC for energy, then we may migrate it across. But at this point, it's looking that we'll have 2, possibly 3 new specifications. And one of the things that Phil Nelson from our organisation is doing is that we're giving our interns something a little bit meaty to get into. So far, we've been showing them about the background to the specs and so on. They've now been given some research to do around, well, what are the kind of things that we would collect? And then the next part is starting to look at putting it into the structure of the specifications. So there's some things to keep an eye out for. We continue to collect dedicated A-SPEC contacts. What's the purpose of this? The purpose and intention of this is that if the consulting industry, it could be a contractor, surveyor, consulting engineer, has a requirement to contact somebody about an A-SPEC query, you know, we've talked a lot today about getting clarification about the purpose of some of the assets, particularly if they're new, then the intention is that an email can go that will be monitored by the assets area that deals specifically with A-SPEC inquiries. We are staying away from generic info@.gov.au type emails because there's too much of a lag between them being seen and being passed on to an area. We're also requesting that this email is not the sole responsibility of one person, so that if a person is away for whatever reason, then that email gets addressed, because often they're quite critical. in terms of response times. Kelly has been putting up some polls about our presentations today. Again, you know, it was just so great to see the two different experiences that actually contribute to the success of this community. You know, we talk about A-SPEC being a knowledge sharing community. We're starting to see that the contributions from the different participants across the board is really what makes it its success. And, you know, being acknowledged for contributing to that, you know, I've really appreciated it. And so do people from our team. So our next forum is next week, and we talk about A-SPEC. So A-SPEC is our most heavily attended forum, and it probably comes back to the importance that road infrastructure assets have in an asset owner's environment. Having said that, we've really enjoyed the increased attendance for each of the forums to date, and we're seeing quite an increased number of registrations across all of the forums. 4th of October is going to be a ripper of a showcase. We've already confirmed our keynote, which you would have received some notification about. There'll be more notifications coming out. We have earmarked 6 presentations, and currently we've fulfilled on 5, the most recent one being Karis Evans from State Government of Victoria, from her department, and she's going to come and talk to us about what her government agency is doing around Digital Twin Victoria. And then we're going to have a small presentation around how it particularly operates. One of the ideas that I had was that if we could access that digital twin platform, maybe we can start putting our A-SPEC members' assets into that to start looking at a bigger picture. You know, maybe start with just D-SPEC, and you know, particularly with the GDV hub's mapping capability. I know that people, organisations take their data in and put it into their structures. Well, with the GDV hub capability, you've got that reverse mapping capability. So whatever you call it now, you can just use the GDV hub to pump it out back into a standard D-SPEC or O-SPEC or R-SPEC framework, which can then consolidate the data rather than having to focus on what are the different fields. So we'll explore that a bit further. So our next forum, we're going to have 2 presenters, Ryan McDonald from JBA Surveys, and he's so keen to present. He's actually told us that he's not available to present. So what he's done is he's created a video of his presentation. So that will be shown next week. So Kelly just will need to make sure that everything's okay with the video so we can get the sound and everything happening. But he's really keen. He'll take us through how he processes and validates A-SPEC, and you know, like our presenters that we've had to date, you know, he's also passionate about what he does. We also have a presenter from industry as well, Jess Nauta from Spire. She's a senior member of their Melbourne surveying team, and she'll take us through her experience engaging in the A-SPEC community. And also Jess has just recently, just an FYI for everyone, Jess has recently become a licensed surveyor, and that occurred about 11 months ago. So we'll get an opportunity to congratulate her for that as well. So aside from that, it's 11:59. our commitment to you is we finish at 12. I'm not going to drag it out any further. I want to acknowledge our team for the effort and the contributions that you've made. I want to acknowledge our presenters for making your presentations really informative and just showing the nuts and bolts about what goes on. Sometimes it is the good, the bad, and the ugly, and we don't shy away from that. And it's all about continuous improvement. So thank you both to Brendan and Jack. And finally, thank you to everybody who's come along today. And by coming along, that's your contribution. We had consistently 72 to 73 people attend right through to the end of the presentations, and it's becoming evident now just how much more valuable these forums are. And thank you for your contribution. Thank you for setting aside the time. And now I'm just going to say goodbye to you all. I'll be here for another 10 to 15 minutes for anyone who wants to stick around and chew the fat, or maybe John Cleverton, we start a H-spec for horticultural spec. Who knows? But got to have a bit of fun with this stuff. Thank you again, and look forward to seeing you all next week.